The chains made loud sounds against the cold dark stone as the guards dragged the human into the throne room of the great citadel, and his name was Cole Hartman, a soldier from Earth who was captured during the terrible battle at Epsilon Reach, and he expected to die very soon. But what happened next surprised him more than anything in his entire life. The Valorian guards were tall beings with pale glowing skin and sharp beautiful features, and they stopped walking suddenly, and the whole room became very quiet, and their queen Seraphis Nighthollow rose slowly from her black throne, and her silver eyes became wide with an expression that nobody in her court had ever seen before, and that expression was recognition. She was beautiful in the way that ancient things are beautiful, and she looked timeless and dangerous and impossible to touch, and her pointed ears swept back through her long dark hair that was black like midnight, and at her side, coiled around the base of her throne, was a dragon named Valthur, and his scales looked like pieces of a dying star, and shadows seemed to flow from his body like smoke. "Leave us now," she commanded in a voice that allowed no argument. The guards looked at each other because no prisoner had ever been allowed to be alone with the queen, but she looked at them with those silver eyes, and they retreated quickly, and the great doors closed behind them with a sound like a tomb being sealed forever. Seraphis walked down the steps of her throne, and her long gown made soft sounds against the stone floor, and she stopped in front of Cole and studied his face carefully, and she looked at his scars and his tired eyes and the defiance that still burned in him, even though he was in chains. "You do not remember me," she said quietly, and it was not a question, but a statement. Cole looked into her eyes without fear and said, "Should I remember you?" The dragon Valthur lifted his great head, and smoke curled from his nostrils, and a low growl filled the chamber like distant thunder. Seraphis reached out her hand, and her fingers stopped just above the scar that ran along Cole's jaw, and she spoke again in a voice barely louder than a whisper. And she said, 200 years ago, by your world counting, there was a burning settlement on a forgotten moon, and a young Valorian girl was wounded and left behind by her own people, and a human boy carried her to safety instead of leaving her to die." Cold breath caught in his throat, and fragments of memory came back to him like pieces of a broken mirror, and he remembered fire and screaming and a girl with silver eyes who begged him not to let go. "That was you," he said, and his voice was full of shock. "That was me," Seraphis said, and she stepped back, and her expression became hard and unreadable, and she continued speaking and said, "And now the boy who saved a forgotten princess has become a soldier in the war against her empire." Behind her, the dragon Valthur rose to his full height and spread his wings, and they stretched out like the coming of night itself, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow deeper and darker. "The council will demand your execution by dawn," she said, "and every Valorian commander will call for human blood to be spilled." "Then why am I still alive?" Cole asked. Seraphis turned away from him and faced the vast window that showed the stars and galaxies, and a universe that was torn apart by war and... She did not answer for a long moment, and finally she spoke again. "Because I have not yet decided what you are, Cole Hartman, and you might be a debt that must be repaid, or you might be a weapon that can be used, and I need time to think about which one is true." Cole watched her standing there against the light of distant stars, and he thought about that night so long ago when he was just 17 years old and scared and surrounded by fire and death, and he had found a wounded girl and carried her through the flames, and he never knew what happened to her after that. Now he knew, and she had become a queen, and she ruled an empire that was trying to destroy his entire species, and yet she had saved his life tonight by sending the guards away and by not ordering his immediate death. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want to understand." Seraphis said without turning around, "And I want to understand why a human boy showed mercy to an enemy when mercy would have cost him nothing to withhold, and I want to understand what makes your species fight so hard when you are clearly losing this war. We are not losing. Cole, said. Seraphis turned and looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something like respect in her silver eyes, and maybe even a small smile on her lips. No, she said quietly. You are not, and that is what frightens my council, and that is why they want you dead, and that is why I need to understand. She walked past him toward the great doors and paused and said over her shoulder, The guards will take you to a room, and you will be comfortable there, and tomorrow we will talk more, and you will tell me about humans, and I will decide what to do with you. And if I refuse to talk? Cole asked, Then you will die. Seraphis said simply, But I do not think you will refuse because you want to understand this too, and you want to know why the girl you saved became the queen who conquered stars. She was right, and Cole knew it, and he wanted answers just as much as she did. And so when the guards came back and took him away, he did not resist, and he walked with them through the dark halls of the citadel, and he thought about silver eyes and a war that suddenly seemed much more complicated than before. Valther remained beside his queen and watched the human leave, and then he spoke in a voice that was not heard, but felt directly in the mind, and he said, This is dangerous. My queen and this human is dangerous, I know, Seraphis said, and that is exactly why I cannot let him die, and not yet, and not until I understand what he represents. And what does he represent? The dragon asked hope, she said, and the word hung in the air like a promise, or maybe like a threat, and she turned and walked back to her throne and sat down and stared at the stars and wondered what she had just begun. The cell they gave him was not a cell at all, and Cole woke up in a room that was more beautiful than anything he had ever seen on Earth, and there was silk bedding and curved walls made of living crystal and a window that showed the slow rotation of the Valorian homeworld far below. It was a cage made of gold, but it was still a cage, and he knew that very well. 3 days passed, and he was completely alone, and meals arrived through machines he could not understand, and the door never opened, and no one came to speak with him, but through it all he felt watched, and not by guards or cameras, but by something much older and much deeper than that. On the 4th night, the shadows in the corner of his room began to move and shift like living things. Valther appeared from the darkness itself, and his form came together like smoke being given shape and purpose. And the dragon was smaller now, about the size of a large wolf, but his eyes burned with an intelligence that was older than human civilization itself. Cole did not show any fear, and he had faced Valorian warships in battle, and a dragon appearing in his bedroom was almost a relief compared to that. You do not show fear, the dragon said, and his voice was not spoken out loud, but was heard directly inside Cole, mind like words forming without sound. Fear is expensive, Cole replied, and I ran out of it years ago. The dragon walked in a slow circle around him and studied him carefully and then spoke again and said, My queen is troubled, and she has not been troubled in a very long time, and this displeases me greatly. I did not ask to be captured. Cole said no. But you are here, and your presence has awakened memories that she buried long ago, Valther said, and he settled down in front of Cole, and smoke curled from his scales that seemed to swallow all the light around them, and he continued, The council votes tomorrow, and 12 voices will call for your death, and Seraphis holds the 13th vote. And which way is she going to vote? Cole asked. She does not know, and that is what troubles her. Valther replied, and then he asked, Tell me, human, what do you remember about that night? And I want the true memory, not just the small pieces. Cole closed his eyes, and the memory came back slowly, and he had to drag it out from the place where he had locked it away many years ago. I was 17 years old. He began, and my unit was running evacuation on a moon called Tethys 4, and Valorian raiders had attacked a colony there, and it was one of your cleansing operations, and he could not keep the anger out of his voice, and most of the colonists were already dead, and we were just trying to find survivors, and there were not many left. And the girl, Valthor, asked, I found her in a building that had collapsed. Cole continued, and she was hurt and bleeding silver, and I did not even know that blood could be that color, and she looked about my age, and her own people had left her behind to die. She was considered defective, Valthor said. And there was something cold in his mental voice, and she was born with a gift that frightened the high families, and they saw the raid as a chance to get rid of a problem. Cole's hands became fists, and he felt anger rising in his chest. She begged me not to leave her, he said, and she told me she could see something in me and something bright, and I did not understand what she meant. The gift, Valthor explained, and Seraphis can see the threads of fate, and she can see the potential inside a soul, and even as a child, she saw what you might become. And what is that, Cole asked. That is what she is still trying to figure out. The dragon replied, and he rose, and his form began to dissolve back into shadow, and he said, Rest. Now, Cole Hartman, and tomorrow your fate, and perhaps her fate will be decided. The dragon disappeared completely, and Cole was alone again. But now the shadows in his room felt different, and they felt alive, and watching and waiting for something that he could not yet understand. He did not sleep that night. And instead he stood at the window and watched the stars, and thought about a girl with silver eyes who had become a queen. And he thought about the war that had killed so many on both sides, and he wondered if there was any way out of all this death and destruction. And somewhere deep in the citadel, Seraphis stood at her own window and looked at the same stars, and thought about a boy who had carried her through fire, and who had shown her that mercy could exist even in the darkest places, and she wondered what she was going to do when the sun came up and the council demanded his blood. Valthor appeared beside her and pressed against her side, and his warmth was the only comfort she had known for centuries. What will you do, my queen? He asked. I do not know, she admitted, and that is the truth, and I truly do not know. The dragon said, Nothing more. And they stood together in the darkness, and waited for dawn to come and bring with it a choice that would change everything. The Council of Thorns met in a chamber, carved from a single massive crystal, and light reflected in patterns that seemed to whisper secrets. And 12 Valorian lords and ladies sat in a curved line, and their faces were masks of cold beauty and even colder judgment. Cole stood in the center of the chamber, and he was not bound, but guards surrounded him, and their weapons made humming sounds with barely contained energy, and above them all on a throne that seemed to grow from the crystal itself sat Seraphis, with Valthor lying at her feet. The eldest counselor spoke first, and he was a male whose face had become sharp with age and almost like a skeleton, and he said the human soldier Cole Hartman was captured during the battle at Epsilon Reach, and he is responsible for destroying 3 Valorian cruisers, and he commanded the human ship that broke our blockade at the Hollow Worlds. Whispers moved through the council like wind through leaves. His knowledge of tactics makes him dangerous. Another counselor added, and his continued existence is an insult to every Valorian who died fighting humans. Cole said nothing because there was nothing to say and the charges were true. However, Seraphis spoke, and the chamber became silent immediately, and she said we must also see that this human represents an opportunity. What opportunity could a human prisoner possibly represent? The skeletal counselor asked, and his voice was full of contempt. Information and strategy and understanding of how humans fight. Seraphis replied, and her voice was calm and measured, and she continued, We have been at war for 30 years. And in that time, humanity has not just survived, but has adapted and learned and evolved, and they find ways to fight back against everything we do. All the more reason to kill him and be done with it. The counselor said, Killing him gives us nothing but a moment of satisfaction. Seraphis said, and she rose from her throne and walked down into the council chamber, and she said, I propose something different, and I propose we question him and study him and learn why humans fight the way they do, and let us understand our enemy before we destroy them. The council members looked at each other, and it was not an unreasonable argument on the surface. There is precedent for this, a younger counselor offered nervously, and the ancient laws allow us to keep prisoners longer if they have strategic value. This is not about precedent. The skeletal counselor shouted and slammed his hand on his seat, and he said this is about justice and about the thousands of Valorian lives that humans have taken. Justice, Cole heard himself say, and the word pulled out of him before he could stop it, and he said, You want to talk about justice. The guards moved closer and raised their weapons. Stand down. Seraphis commanded, and her eyes met Cole, and she said, Let him speak. Tethys 4. Cole said, And that was the colony your raiders cleansed, and 3,000 humans lived there, and they were families with children, and you burned them alive and called it necessary. And at Epsilon Reach we were defending a hospital ship and a hospital ship, and his voice grew stronger. You want to kill me for fighting back, and you can go ahead and do it, but do not pretend it is justice, because it is just war. Silence filled the chamber completely. Then Seraphis did something that would be talked about in whispers for centuries to come, and she smiled. The council will vote, she announced, and those who want immediate execution, raise your hand. 11 hands went up. Those who want to keep him for strategic study, only one hand rose, and it was her own. The vote is 11-1, the skeletal counselor declared with triumph in his voice, and the human will be executed at dawn. I invoke the queen privilege, Seraphis said. The words hit the chamber like a physical blow, and several counselors gasped, and others turned pale. You cannot do that, the eldest counselor whispered, and the privilege has not been used in 300 years, and yet it is still law. Seraphis returned to her throne, and Velther rose beside her, and she said, The Queen privilege allows me to override any council decision in matters I believe are essential to the survival of our empire, and I am using it now. This is madness, the counselor said, and over a single human prisoner. This human, Seraphis said quietly, represents something the council refuses to see, and humanity is not losing this war, and they are learning from it. And unless we understand why, we will wake up one day to find that we are the ones facing extinction. She gestured to the guards and said, Take him back to his room, and he is now under my personal protection. As Cole was led away, he looked back once, and Seraphis' silver eyes met his, and they were impossible to read. But Velther, if dragons could have expressions, looked almost pleased. Weeks became months, and Cole's golden cage grew larger, and he was given access to certain parts of the citadel, and guards always walked with him, and he was always being watched. But the watching started to feel less like being a prisoner and more like being studied. Seraphis called for him often, and sometimes they talked about military strategy, and she asked questions about how humans planned their battles, and sometimes they talked about philosophy and the morality of war and what survival really meant, and sometimes in the quiet hours of night, they just talked like two people who were tired of a war that neither of them had chosen to start. "Why did you save me?" she asked one night while standing before the great window that showed the stars. And she asked that night on Tethys 4 you were a soldier and I was your enemy, so why did you do it? You were a kid, Cole said, and you were scared and alone. And he shrugged and said, the uniform does not change that my people would say it does. Seraphis replied, and they would say that species defines everything and that humans are beneath consideration. And what do you say? Cole asked. Seraphis was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, I say that a human boy showed me more kindness in one moment than my own people showed me in 17 years. And she turned to face him and said, maybe that means something. Velther was lying nearby, and he lifted his head and said the council is growing restless, and they believe the queen has lost her judgment, and there are whispers of something being planned. Let them whisper. Seraphis said, and I am still the queen. For now, the dragon said with warning in his voice, and not all threats come from the council chamber, and word has reached the outer fleets, and Commander Valeth is coming back from the front. Lines, and she has a lot of support from the military families. Cole knew that name, and Commander Valeth was called the Bloodless Hand, and she was responsible for the siege at Proxima Colony where 40,000 humans died, and not a single Valorian was lost. She is your rival, he said. She believes she should be queen. Seraphis confirmed, and she believes I have become weak and sentimental. And maybe she is right about that. What will you do? Cole asked. What I must, Seraphis said, and she moved toward the door, and then she stopped and said, Cole, that night when you saved me, I told you, I could see something bright in you, and do you want to know what it was? He nodded. Hope, she said simply, and you were drowning in violence and death and everything was horrible around you, and still you chose mercy and that brightness and that stubborn, impossible. Hope is what makes humanity dangerous, and it is not your weapons or your ships, but your refusal to give in to darkness. She left before he could say anything. Falthur stayed and watched Cole with his ancient eyes. She cares for you, the dragon said. And this has never happened before, and it is very, very dangerous. Dangerous for her? Or for me, Cole asked. Yes, the dragon replied. The next morning, Commander Valeth arrived with 7 warships, and it was a display of power that was almost a challenge to the throne. And she walked into the citadel like a conquering hero with loyal officers around her. She was beautiful, like a sharp blade is beautiful, and her silver-white hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes were like frozen stars, and her smile had never known warmth. My queen, she said while kneeling before Seraphis with too much respect, and she said, I bring news from the front, and the human resistance at Kepler sector has been destroyed, and their fleet is scattered, and victory is coming soon, and at what cost? Seraphis asked. Acceptable losses, Valeth said, and rose to her feet, and then she smiled that cold smile and said, Though I understand there have been complications here at court, and I hear rumors about a human prisoner being treated like a guest instead of an enemy. His information has been valuable. Seraphis said, Has it? Valeth said, and then she gestured, and her guards dragged forward a human woman in a torn medical uniform, and Cole recognized her immediately, and it was Lieutenant Maya Frost, a medic from his own unit. We caught a rescue mission, Valeth explained, and 3 human ships trying to save prisoners, and this one was asking questions about you. Commander Hartman. Maya's eyes found Cole, and they were filled with relief and despair at the same time. The humans have not given up hope of saving their hero. Valeth continued, and how touching and how useful this could be. Valeth stood in the throne room with her cold smile, and she said, I propose a public execution of both prisoners, and it will send a message to humanity that their hope is wrong and their heroes can die, and unless, of course, your majesty has any objection. The room had filled with Valorian nobles and military officers, and people who supported Valeth and Cole understood this was a test of power, and if Seraphis protected him now, she would look weak, and Valeth would have everything she needed to take the throne. The queen privilege cannot be used twice for the same prisoner. Valeth added smoothly, and the law is clear, and you only delayed what was always going to happen. Seraphis sat very still, and Valthur pressed against her side and growled constantly. The new prisoner has not been judged yet, Valeth continued, and I am happy to move quickly and we can execute them together and it will be a fitting end. Cole stepped forward and said, Let her go. Valeth looked at him and said, Excuse me. The medic, he said, and she is nobody important, and just a doctor who got unlucky and she has no value to you, and let her go, and I will accept whatever sentence you want, and no fighting and no problems. Maya started to protest, but a guard silenced her. How noble, Valeth laughed and said, Human emotion in action. But I am afraid that accepted everyone turned to look at Seraphis. "The trade is accepted," she repeated and rose from her throne, and she said, "Commander Valeth, you will release the human medic to a safe zone, and in exchange, Cole Hartman will face public judgment." Valeth's smile flickered, because this was not the reaction she expected. "Furthermore," Seraphis said, and she walked down the steps, and something in her presence seemed to grow darker and larger, and Valther followed her and grew with each step until he was huge behind her like a shadow, given terrible form, and she said, "Since you care so much about justice, Commander, you will serve as the one who carries out the execution." "It would be my honor," Valeth said, but she did not look so confident now. Good Seraphis said, and stopped right in front of her rival, and spoke, so everyone could hear, and she said, "The execution will happen at dawn, and the human will die by the queen fire, which is my fire sent through my blade, and this death is only for enemies of great importance." Whispers ran through the crowd because the queen fire had not been used in hundreds of years. And Commander Valeth Seraphis added, "Will stand beside me as witness to make sure everything is done correctly." The trap was so elegant that most people did not see it, and Valeth could not refuse without looking like a coward, and could not object without admitting this was all about politics. Cole was taken away, and as he passed Seraphis, she whispered something only he could hear, and she said, "Trust me." Dawn came cold and silver over the citadel, and Cole stood on the platform with his hands bound and faced a crowd of thousands, and Valeth waited nearby, barely hiding her joy, and Seraphis approached in battle armor with Valther at her side, and the ancient blade of her family glowed with fire inside it. The ritual words were spoken, and the crowd fell silent, and Seraphis raised the blade, and Valther moved. The dragon exploded into shadow and flowed past Seraphis and past Cole and went straight into Valeth, and the commander screamed as darkness surrounded her and revealed what the dragon had known all along, and there were hidden weapons and assassins placed in the crowd and a plan to kill the queen during the execution. Everything became chaos, but it was brief. When the smoke cleared, Valeth was in chains and her plot was exposed, and her supporters were captured or running, and Cole stood free because the ceremonial fire had burned through his chains instead of his body. "The commander is guilty of treason," Seraphis announced to the shocked crowd, "and she will be judged properly." And then she turned to Cole and said, "As for the human prisoner," everyone held their breath. "He has served his purpose," she said, "and his intelligence value has been used, and by offering himself he revealed enemies in our own empire, and he will be returned to his people with a message." She stepped close enough that only Cole could hear, and she said, "The message is this, and the war does not have to continue. And there are some among my people who would want peace, and who remember that mercy is not weakness." And she pressed something into his hand, which was a small crystal that glowed with inner light, and she said, "When you are ready to truly talk, then activate this, and I will hear you." Cole looked at the crystal and then at her, and asked, "Why? And after everything, why are you helping me?" Seraphis smiled, and for one moment, he saw not the queen, but the scared girl he had carried through fire 200 years ago. "Because hope spreads," she said. "And you gave it to me long ago, and now go before I change my mind." Valther made a sound that might have been laughter. As Cole was taken to a ship with Maya beside him, he looked back once at the citadel at the queen standing on the highest balcony with her dragon beside her. The war would continue, and more blood would be spilled. But something had changed, and there was a crack in the wall of endless war, and there was a possibility that had not existed before, and in his hand a crystal glowed with light and waited for the day when two worlds might finally choose to talk instead of fight. The alien queen had seen the human prisoner and recognized him from long ago, but what she truly saw was the future burning and beautiful and uncertain, and in the space between two hearts that remembered kindness, something new had started to grow, something called hope.